When we were working with variants before, we were adding variants. Now we're going to look at how they can be displayed. This is an entry where we added a variant, and if we look in the preview pane, we see that the variant appears as a reference. We can see that this entry says, I have a variant that is a dialect variant, and the dialectal variant is color. So this reference is pointing at the variant. Now, if we go to the variant entry itself, it looks a bit different. Now remember, we can tell that this entry is a variant entry because it has these fields for variant type and variant of. Now, the reason this display is different is because for variants, we usually don't need to display very much about it. The word is the same as the main entry, it's just slightly different. And so for this, we're formatting it in a format that we call minor entry. And the minor entry format means that it's not really a full entry, it's really basically just a reference. It's a placeholder. It's still going to have its place in the alphabet, but all it does is point the reader to the other entry where all the other information is. So this can be considered a cross-reference. Now, if we want to configure this, let's see what happens if we right-click and go to Configure Dictionary View. Now, the node for headword is highlighted, but notice the node above it, it's called Minor Entry Variants. And if I scroll up, we'll see that main entry is up at the top, and then there are these other two nodes. I can collapse main entry to help us see it a bit better. There are 3 nodes, one for main entry and 2 for minor entry, one for minor entry complex forms and one for minor entry variants. That's because complex forms and variants are both dependent entries and both have the option of displaying as a minor entry. There's other ways they can display as well, but this is the node for configuring the variant when it displays as a minor entry. So let's open these back up again. Now notice that the nodes underneath each of these major nodes are pretty similar up at the entry level. They look the same. Now, if I come down here into the node that I'm in, I can tick the box for lexeme form, and notice that the lexeme form appears again. Now, I wouldn't want it to display like this. I'm just trying to show that it made a difference if I ticked something. So, under this cluster, minor entry variants, that's where ticking something makes a difference. Now, I will untick it, but if I come up to the main entry node and tick the box for lexeme form, nothing happens over here. So keep in mind, this is a way that might lead to confusion, that these look very similar to those down there, but when you're trying to configure a variant, you want to be sure to be in this node, not in the main entry node. So again, it's important to know what kind of entry you're configuring for display. Now, down here in the minor entries node, it's not showing very much. The headword is what you would expect, the word at the margin. There are a lot of things ticked, but because there's not very much recorded in the entry in the project, most of them are not showing. The most important thing we need to see is this variant of node. Now, if we expand it, we can see that under variant of, there's variant type, and if I click the highlight, it shows me what the variant type is. This is the label for what type of variant it is, how it relates to the main entry. And then there's a node for reference entries. And again, the highlight shows me that's the target, and this would be a live link. So the variant type and the reference entries are the most important. There's a field for comment. Often that's not filled in, but you can fill it in if you want. Now notice that reference entries can be expanded. There are more items under that. And for now, the only thing we care about is the referenced headword. These other things are not there. They're not filled in. And those will be talked about in a different lesson. So basically, in a minor entry, the main thing you see is the variant type and the referenced headword. So let's close this up. Now, let's take a look at what this looks like in the dictionary view. you can see that the main entry has more stuff in it. It has the meaning and it has an example sentence, whereas the minor entry is just very abbreviated. So keep in mind that this is basically a reference entry. And online, this is a live link. So if you click on the target, it takes you to that other entry. And again, if you click on the target of the reference version of the variant, it takes you to the minor entry. Let's look at a different variant. We entered the word zucchini, and it also appears as a minor entry. Let's go look at it in Lexicon Edit. Now, keep in mind that the entry for zucchini was a main entry before we turned it into a variant. And because of that, it has a gloss. There are things in the sense. It has a sense section. But the sense section is not displaying, and that's because we have this configured as a minor entry. But let's look again at the configure dialog. Notice that under minor entry variants, there is a node for senses. It's just unticked by default. Now, if I were to tick this box, notice that all of the rest of the sense now appears. So this tells us that even though something is a variant, it's possible to configure it to display as if it were a main entry. So here this is looking more like a main entry. But if you want it configured to look like a minor entry, normally you would untick senses. Or maybe you would only want part of what's in the senses cluster. You could untick everything but keep just the gloss. I will close that back up again. But keep in mind that there's a lot of things you can do for ways to configure a minor entry. Now let's go back to our dictionary view. Now, here is another entry that has a variant. This is the entry for throw. And in this case, the variant type is past. It's saying my past variant is through. And then there's the minor entry right there. Now let's configure this one. We'll right click. And again, it's configured in the minor entry variants node because it is also a variant. But let's look at one more thing. If we click on the parent node, we see that we have this options list in the middle. It's showing us all of the variant types. So when you're on the top node of a cluster that has to do with a variant, you get this options list showing the different variant types. Now what this allows you to do is to configure different variant types differently. And so what if we decided we didn't want minor entries for past? We want to keep them for dialect variant, but not for past. We can untick this button, and notice in the preview pane it goes away because this entry is no longer displaying as a minor entry. So I will click OK. And in our dictionary view, notice that we only have throw now. We don't have through anymore. And yet we still have the dialect variants. The minor entries for dialect variants are still there. So that's a very powerful thing. And just as a side note, if you right-click on a reference for a variant, okay, that takes us to the main entry cluster and the variant forms node within that. And notice variant forms also has the options list. So if I decided I did not want to show the references for dialect variants, I could untick that box. Now I do want it to show. Now again, keep in mind all of these pieces under it can also be configured, so maybe I don't want to show the variant type. Okay, here I'm just showing the variant. Now often that's confusing and there's an extra space. I'm going to turn it back on. Now note that the variant type can be displayed as the abbreviation, or we can hide the abbreviation, or we can display it as the name. Note that now the full name of the variant type is showing. That's up to the compiler which way they want to do it. I will untick name and put abbreviation back. And also note that on variant form, I could hide the whole variant form. Now if I do that, the whole entire cluster goes away Flex is smart enough to know not to show a variant type if there is no form that it's pointing at. So I will tick that again and make it come back. So keep in mind that there are a lot of options here. It's very powerful. Now notice that when we were configuring the node for minor entry variants, the settings were going to apply for all variant entries when they're displayed as a minor entry. It's different from what they display as a reference, but this is for the variants displayed as a minor entry. Or we could use the options list to configure things for all of a certain type. So in this way we unticked past, so past is being displayed differently from these other ones. But what if we want to configure things on an entry by entry basis? Let me turn past back on so that we can look at that in more detail. I will click OK. So let's go to this entry through that is the past of throw. Now in this case, they occur very close to each other in the dictionary, in the alphabet. And so maybe it doesn't make sense to have both of them. The reference is enough. We don't need the minor entry. In other cases, if they occurred very far apart alphabetically, then you would want both of them. So let's go back to Lexicon Edit. And in the entry for through, up here we see the minor entry. Now way down at the bottom of the entry in the Lexicon Edit view, there's a series of fields in the section called Publication Settings. Now the very bottom one is called Show Minor Entry. And if we hover over it, we see a tooltip that says that I want to show this entry as a minor entry in the dictionary. Now this is on a per entry basis. So watch the preview pane. If I untick this box, then that minor entry goes away. Now if I go back to the dictionary, I see that other minor entries are still there. These minor entries are there. But if I go down to throw, there is no entry for through. So let me go back to the Lexicon Edit. I will go back to the through entry. So keep this in mind as a way to configure things on an entry by entry basis. There aren't many ways to do that in Flex, but this is one of them. Now there are other fields in this publication settings section, and if you hover over them, the tooltip shows you something. Here this talks about should the current entry be included as a head word, and for the kind of thing we're looking at right now, we're looking at a variant that basically means as a minor entry. Now when we get to complex forms, it will be more involved than that. It will have other meanings. So for variants, these two do basically the same thing, except that here you can configure it on a publication per publication basis. Now, this other field has to do with removing this entry completely from this publication. And we will talk about publications later. I won't go into details about what a publication is. But the key thing with this is it removes not only the minor entry display of it, but also the reference, that it won't appear anywhere at all. It wouldn't appear in reversal entries either. We have not gotten to reversal entries. So these three fields have slightly different behaviors about how much the entry appears. The bottom one just controls whether this specific entry gets displayed as a minor entry, and the top one controls whether it gets displayed at all, either as a minor entry or as a reference. So again, that's additional ways that you can configure.